welcome back to From the Deck. And today we have another video. Now I'm recording this before having a reunion or a meet, whatever you want to call it, with some work people, because I do have a work. It doesn't appear like that because of this, but I do have a work. So I'll have to use this microphone instead of the regular microphone there, and as such, this is going to stay on camera. But that's not why we're here to earth. Here we are today for we are going to show and we are going to continue the Yu-Gi-Oh! For Dummies saga with the episode 3 brought to you by Eliras from TeamNDL, who graciously recorded the spells and traps section of this video. Now, just because I haven't participated in it yet doesn't mean I haven't recorded anything for it yet. But it also means that I haven't recorded anything for it yet. But don't worry, I'll take it up from here. And if you want to participate and record your own video just to, put it on this library, on this encyclopedia, please feel free to. And just send it to me if you want to be showcased it on the channel. Or if you don't, then just tell me and I'll add it to the playlist, etc. So everyone can see it, the full series complete. But without further ado, I will just leave you with TeamNDL and the spells and traps section of today.
Hello and welcome! How are you doing today? Hopefully you're doing fine. I'm Eliras from TeamNDL, and in today's video we're going to talk about spells and traps, as you probably already heard from YT a little bit beforehand. But, before we'll jump right into the actual categories of spells and traps, you're probably asking yourself, what exactly are spells and traps? Well, spells and traps are cards that you can only run in the main deck, which is basically the additional cards beside main deck monsters, so basically you have them as the additional two categories, and they can be activated specifically only in the row behind your monsters, which is supposed to be the spells and traps zone. So behind your main deck monsters, there's supposed to be a row for spells and traps, which is there for them specifically. You can only have 5 spells and traps set or active at the time, so if all of them are full, you cannot activate a new one, just like how it works with monsters. Of course, it's a little bit more harder with spells and traps, but we'll get to that when we'll get to different kinds of categories. Now, spells themselves are supposed to be cards that have the green border, as been shown on screen, and they basically just cards that's supposed to help you during your own turn with either additional effects that's supposed to support you and help you, or weaken the opponent. As for traps, there are cards that need to be set in your turn first before they can be activated in the next following turn, which is supposed to be your opponent's turn, when a condition has been met or when a specific thing happens. And they're basically recognizable by their purple border. But that's pretty much what they are for a total. There are obviously different kinds of categories, which we'll jump right into them. But first off, we're going to jump right into the spells because they're a little bit more easier to understand. And in spells specifically, you have 6 categories which haven't been changed from the start of the game, which are normal spells, continuous spells, quick play spells, equip spells, field spells, and ritual spells. These are basically the 6 baseline of spells. There's also a 7th one, which is not exactly a category, but we'll talk about it anyway a little bit at the end, because I think it's a little bit important to mention anyway. But spell cards originally been called magic card and have been changed into spell cards because Magic the Gathering, a problem because, you cannot call your cards magic cards because Magic the Gathering hold the name essentially. But that's pretty much what the categories are, and we're going to explain them through one to one, and we're going to start off with normal spells. And normal spells are the baseline of spells. You just activate them, you let them resolve, and then you send them to the graveyard. They're one-time use, they have to stay on the field until their effect is resolved or negated, and then they're sent in the graveyard. Just like with this card specifically, Reinforcement of the Army. A very classic card that allowing you to add to your hand as its own effect a level 4 or lower warrior monster from your deck to your hand. Now, until you don't add the warrior monster from your deck to your hand, the card will stay on the field, and once you finish the action, the card will be sent to the graveyard, or if your opponent negated your action to essentially add the card, you basically send the card to the garbage, basically, after it's been used, and send it to the graveyard. That's pretty much what is for normal spells. They're pretty basic. They really don't need any explanation for them. And like I said, they're one-time use. After you're done with them, you send them to the graveyard. However, the 3 other spells after that are not exactly like that. And we're going to start off with the more simplest one out of all of them, and that is continuous spells. And continuous spells are spells that are supposed to be a little bit more powerful most of the time, because they're supposed to be staying on the field forever until your opponent removes them or when the game ends, obviously. Continuous spell, like their name states, as I mentioned, are continuous. And basically, with this card specifically, which is Dark Contact with a Gate, it stays on the field, and every turn, once per turn, as mentioned in this text, you can search a DD monster from your deck to your hand. Now, of course, there's also the maintenance cost, but that's most of the time doesn't really matter. The point is, as long as the card stays on the field and they have a particular effect, you can every turn activate it. Now, of course, it depends on the card, because if the card states when this card is activated, it's only a one-time use effect, but when it says once per turn, every turn you can use this particular effect as long as the card is on the field. However, continuous spells do have a particular weakness compared to normal spells. If your opponent removes them with a particular way, which either by spell or trap removal, or with a particular card that can do that and remove them in mid-effect, the effect will not resolve, because the card needs to stay on the field to let the effect resolve. So to let you understand that, for example, in this particular card case, Dark Contract with the Gate, if specifically my opponent will activate a card like Mystical Space Typhoon, then remove it and destroy it from the field once I search, I basically don't get the search. That's pretty much how that works. And that's kind of continuous spells for, how they work. Then the next category is CanEquip Spells, which are basically continuous spells, but they have to be equipped to a monster, even your own monster or the opponent monster. And they're even more susceptible than continuous spells, because the moment that the monster is being removed from the field, they will be destroyed. That's pretty much what they are. They're basically the same as continuous spells. They can activate their effect as long as they're on the field, or they have their effect continually going on as a continuous aura. But once a monster that they're equipped to is removed, they'll be sent to the graveyard. Next up, we're going to talk about field spells, which are just the same as continuous spells, but unlike continuous spells, they're a little bit different, because they have their own particular special zone, which is called the field spell zone, which is supposed to be in the top left of your field, if I remember that correctly from placement. And basically they're going specifically for there. They're basically mostly very, very powerful cards for their own archetype, unless of course their effect is not really the best, but they're supposed to be having an effect that is very noticeable, because they're supposed to only have one of these at a time, and they're supposed to be really, really powerful. Such with this card specifically, which is, Zephyra, the Oracle of Zephyra. This card specifically, on activation, give you a Zephyra card. Basically, it's also have some other effects on top of it, but the point is, on activation, it's giving you the Zephyra card. Now, one thing that should be mentioned though is that field spells, unlike continuous spells, could be switched. Unlike of your other spells and trap zones, this has its own special zone, and because you can only have one, you could continue switching them. So if, for example, you have a handful of field spells, you can activate one, then activate the other, then activate the other, then activate the other. But you can only have one at a time. And when you set them in the field spell zone, not in the spell and trap zones. Field spells have their own different zone. That's how that works. And they're supposed to be, like I said, special, very powerful effect most of the time. Then we're moving on to quick play spells. And quick play spells are probably the most complicated ones out of all of them. Because quick play spells have multiple functions that are better than other spells. Their entire idea that they work in the same way as normal spells, they're one-time used and they're sent to the graveyard. But, unlike normal spells, quick play spells can be activated all the time during your own turn. So for example, unless of course damage calculation, but the point is, for example, let's say I activate a monster effect, my opponent trying to respond to it, but I do have a quick play spell in my hand. I can immediately chain that up to that particular spell, the particular trap that they activated. So for example, let's say they have a continuous trap, like I mentioned before, when a continuous card is being removed, his effect doesn't really work. So basically, you normal summon a monster, they activate a particular continuous trap, and then you activate a quick play spell from your hand, and the quick play spell just can activate immediately and just remove it. So that's how continuous spells work. There are noticeable with their, what they're called, bolts there, which is supposed to be their symbol, just to represent that they're quick. And these cards are really, really cool for that department, but they also have another use. Basically, if you set them to your side of the field, which unlike normal spells, if you set a spell to your side of the field, you can activate during your own turn or whatever you want to. Quick play spells, if you set them, they will function as a trap. So if you set, for example, a quick play spell like Mystical Space Typhoon, it will function as a trap, and you cannot activate it for the rest of the turn, only the turn after, which will be your opponent's turn. But for your own turn, if you leave it in your hand, you can activate it for the duration of the entire turn. That's how quick play spells work. Then lastly, we have ritual spells. And ritual spells are basically my favorite kind of spells. Ritual spells are supposed to be represented with the castle-like symbol, and ritual spells are supposed to be the other half for ritual monsters. However, ritual spells are a little bit more interesting than you think. While most of the time a specific ritual spell and a ritual monster are going together, there are some specific ritual spells that mention that they can use for any card, or, they ritual summon any monster with a specific condition. If the ritual monster does not specify that you have to use this ritual spell and you have to use a specific condition, the one that will determine the summoning will be the ritual spell. So for example, let's take Revendred Slayer, which says it can be summoned with any Vendred ritual spell, Revendred ritual spell, whatever. Point is that if you activate, for example, even its not own ritual spell, which is, for example, the Drytron ritual spell, because it doesn't specifically list that you have to use the Vendred ritual spells, it just say you can summon it, you could use the Drytron ritual spell with its own summoning requirements to summon said Revendred Slayer monster. That's pretty much how they work, and essentially that's how ritual spells are. And then for the last kind of spells, I guess, it's technically not a spell, but it should be mentioned, and that is Pendulum Monsters. Pendulum Monsters are a specific kind of, monster, which have been mentioned in Sir Scrub's video, but Pendulum Monsters are basically continuous spells for their own purposes. So if you activate them in your Pendulum zones, which are supposed to be the left and rightmost, zones of your spells and trap zones, they're basically act as continuous spells and have the same particular, conditions as continuous spells. But on top of that, they allow you to, pendulum summon if you have two of them. That's pretty much how they work. They're not really their own category, but I thought I will mention it for a little bit because, they're kind of function like continuous spells, so it should be mentioned. But that does it for the spells. Now we'll move on into the traps. And for the traps, you have three categories, technically four, which we'll talk about in the end, but traps have three categories. And like I said, they need to be set up first before you can activate them during the next turn, which should be your opponent's turn. So normal traps are basically the same as spells. They're kind of function in the same way. They can be activated for one time and one time only, and they can only be activated as a reaction to something that your opponent does, or, during your opponent's turn when a condition has been met. But only when your opponent does something. So traps cannot be activated just willy-nilly. For example, if your opponent normal summon a monster, then you can activate the trap. If your opponent draw a card, then you can activate the trap. You cannot activate traps before. And traps cannot be stopped by anything but a continuous, not continuous spell, a quick play spell. They cannot be respond to anything but a quick play spell, another trap, or a monster with a quick effect, basically. So traps are supposed to be in level of speed that is higher to normal cards, or should I say monsters and normal spells. So quick play spells, other traps, and monsters with quick effects can respond into the trap activation, but anything else cannot. So just should mention about that. That's pretty much does it for normal traps. Normal traps are, like I said, like normal spells in the terms of their basic application. You activate them once and then they're sent to the graveyard. And yeah, that's pretty much it. As for continuous traps, same idea. They work in the same way as continuous spells. Although most of the time they have their own negative aura against your opponent, basically. So continuous traps are activated during your opponent's turn, and they also have the same applications as continuous spells, but, you know, they have the negative aura or the bonus benefit, crazy benefit during your own turn, your opponent's turn, to either help you protect your cards or essentially just like deal with your opponent. That's pretty much what they do. And then for the last category of traps, which is not the special one, which we'll talk about, we have a special and new one called counter traps. And counter traps are basically the fastest thing alive in Yu-Gi-Oh! If you activate a counter trap, your opponent cannot respond to it beside another counter trap. So for example, let's say I'm activating a Solemn Judgment, which is this particular card right here. If I activate a Solemn Judgment, your opponent cannot respond to it without responding with another counter trap, basically. If you cannot respond to it with another counter trap, this will be the top of the chain. Most of the time, because of that, counter trap either have a particular requirement and sometimes a steep cost, just like with Solemn Judgment, which require to pay half of your life points. But, you know, they're supposed to be the most powerful and epitome of Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards in terms of speed. But that's pretty much does it for traps, except from the last one, which is called hand traps. Now, these are not exactly traps, but I thought I will still mention them because if you don't really know about them, it's sometimes really frustrating. So, hand traps are supposed to be, most of the time, funny enough, monsters that have trap effects. So it's basically a trap attached to a stick, basically, of a monster. For example, like, you know, a tuner, like Ash Blossom, which is supposed to be appearing on screen. It's a tuner level 3, which is also a zombie. So it's basically a trap-like effect that attached to a stick. Basically, the point of hand traps specifically is to give the second-going player advantage against the first-going player, which most of the time in this modern-day Yu-Gi-Oh!, the games have turned very, very fast, so hand traps are a necessary evil, and you can see running from 3 to 15 hand traps in most traditional decks, basically. So hand traps are very, very important. And most of the time, like I said, they're attached to a monster, and basically kind of like a trap effect, but some hand traps are hand traps. And they're actually what they are, like things like Infinite Impermanence, which is an actual trap that can be activated from hand. But that's pretty much it for traps. Honestly, I don't think I need to explain way too much into it. If there's any kind of like questions that you don't really understand, let me know in the comments down below. Basically, I tried to explain this as the most brief and easiest way as possible, without going way too much into detail. So I'm hoping I am very, very clear for the most part. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you do, and follow my man From the Deck to IT, and I'll see you in the next video, maybe on my own channel. Bye-bye.